Hey guys, my name is Joanna, also known as Just Another Flutist here on YouTube, and I know that the new school year is rolling in very soon. So for those of you who are now enrolled in music school for your first year, you're probably a little bit nervous about what is to come. So I thought that I would share my experience of taking music history for the first time, and hopefully you guys won't make the same mistakes as me. So a little bit of background on me. Before I entered music school, I actually had very little experience with studying music history. The extent of music history that I had was just looking up some biographies of composers. This is because when I was taking piano lessons down in California, I was taking something called the Certificate of Merit, which includes the practical exams for piano, so the ones where you actually play and you're judged by a judge, but it was also accompanied with theory exams that went along with each grade. The music history section of these theory exams were really just name one composer from each musical era. And so that is why most of my music history knowledge was just little tidbits on composers here and there. And we really only looked up the biographical information about these composers just to help me remember the names of these composers and which era they were from. Some of you know that I moved up to Vancouver when I was 14, so many of you are probably wondering why I had no experience with RCM history exams. RCM is the Royal Conservatory of Music, which is like the big music examination program that they have in Canada. But the thing is, I didn't actually take those exams until I was in university. I actually took them on my off time and in the summer. And I only did them so that I could get my flute ARCT. I forget exactly what ARCT stands for. I will put it here for you to see. But essentially that's a performance diploma for the flute under RCM. And the only way to get that diploma is to complete all of the prerequisites, which include music theory and music history exams. There you have it. Basically, I could only name a few composers. In terms of where they belonged in the context of music history in general, I had pretty much zero idea. This is me walking into music history. Now, let's talk about my experience with history classes in general. I did take IB history. IB is International Baccalaureate. It's like advanced placement AP classes, but it's more of a holistic approach. So all of my classes were IB. Yes, if you were wondering, I did IB diploma. I was one of those Asian kids. I did not particularly feel I would do well in geography. That is the only reason why I took history. My experience with history exams were mostly multiple choice, some short answer, and we were told to prepare for certain essay questions. It wasn't absolutely paramount for you to memorize literally everything, because these multiple choice answers would include those answers written down on your piece of paper. So as long as you kind of remembered it, you would pick the right answer. When it came to short answer stuff like list 3 things that happened in this battle, as far as what I was expected to do, you just had to list 3 bullet points, and that was it. You didn't have to expand on it. Yes, I am foreshadowing what happened to me in my music history course. However, when it came to your essay question, you did of course have to answer as a full essay, but we had plenty of practice in class on how to prepare to write an essay for these questions. And more often than not, we were given a list of possible questions that we would need to answer in essay form. For those of us go-getters, we would go home and pretty much write a full essay for those questions, almost memorize them, and then pretty much regurgitate it on the piece of paper when you got to the exam. People who didn't do it that way at least would write a ton of notes on each of the potential essay questions that we would get asked. And in that way, you would remember all the things that you need to talk about, and then you would just write it all out in essay form once you got to the exam. So as you can imagine, by the time I got into music school, I was not taking music history itself very seriously because it had never been taken seriously in my life at all prior to getting into music school. The second thing was that in terms of music history, I never felt like I had to study too much because a lot of the answers would be kind of hidden in plain sight on the exam itself, and I felt that as long as I knew generally what happened in music history, then I would do totally fine on these exams. Yes, more foreshadowing. Now, I walk into music history. A couple of things are different from what I expected. I wasn't expecting the textbooks that we were assigned. Did you notice that I said textbooks, plural? This is A History of Western Music, Burkholder, Grout, and Poliska, published by W.W. Norton and Company in New York and London. Now, you see how hefty this textbook is? I am not joking when I tell people that going to music school really feels like you're going to Hogwarts. Even your history class has textbooks that are large enough for your professor to tell you to turn to page 394. How many pages are in here? Clearly over 1,000 pages. I have the 7th edition. I do not know what edition is out now. This will probably date me. Now, this book pretty much just goes through history stuff. It has some excerpts here and there, as you can see, but mostly it's just a textbook. It's just telling you what happened in music history. Now, the second book that we have is called The Norton Anthology of Western Music. This one is volume 2. I do have volume 1. They go in conjunction with each other. So these anthologies go with the textbooks. Why is it called an anthology? It is because these are straight up the music. They're like essays after these excerpts. And it goes in a lot of detail about how these pieces were composed, why they were composed the way they were, who were they composed by, blah, blah, blah. The anthology is mostly about the actual pieces being written. The textbook is about the history around when these were written. These will actually refer to each other. On top of this, because you've got your anthology, it's not a surprise that you have the pack of CDs to go with it. Can you imagine then what would be on the exam? Listening exercises, right? So basically you are playing classical Name That Tune. However, usually when you are taking an exam in music history, you are studying pieces from the same era, which means that a lot of these pieces may sound very similar. Now, granted, there are several styles within the same era. That is always such a relief. But for example, if you were doing medieval music, not all of it sounds different from each other. Now, for me, I thought to myself, they can't be that mean. They would at least choose contrasting excerpts, right? I also thought that they would play the piece from the beginning. So the pieces that they would play would be the ones that are listed in here in full that are recorded here. Now, the thing is, think about how long an exam is going to be. Typically, your class would be somewhere between an hour to an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, depends on how your school splits up their courses. You don't have this course every day, you have it 2 or 3 times a week. So if you have it 3 times a week, then you would probably have like an hour or an hour and a half each time. If you do 2 times a week, you may end up with like 2 or 3 hours per lecture, seminar, whatever you want to call them. That means for the exam, typically you would only be writing this exam for about hour and a half. In this exam, you have what we just said, listening examples. If you see how long these pieces are, there ain't no way they are playing the entire excerpt for you to identify. That means that they will only be playing an excerpt. Now, it would be way too easy to only play the first few bars because professors will know that their students will only listen to the first few bars and memorize it and then just regurgitate information once they hear the first few bars. But the thing is, professors want you to learn. They want you to actually know why it's written the way it's written, who was it written by, how was it written. That is why they will pick a random excerpt in the middle of the pieces. This means that you do actually have to listen to the entire piece. This means then that you cannot actually cram for these exams. But of course, what did I do? I crammed. I always crammed. That was how I studied for history exams. All of my IB history exams, I will be the first one to admit that I crammed for all of them. All of them. There is not one that I remember studying for at least a week in advance. I always studied the night before. I don't know how I aced my exams. Somehow I did. And I think it was because I took it for granted that I would see the answers hidden in plain sight on the exam. Listening examples are not like this. Listening exams in music history tend to ask for a couple of things, and they're complete blanks. Usually you do not get multiple choice. Usually you do not get matching. It is completely blank. You are given a piece of paper and it says number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. Typically you're given about 5 listening examples. You will be asked to list the composer, the name of the piece, the year it was written in, and the most important stylistic details about this piece. Basically, what makes it so special that you had to study it. So this means that if you cannot identify what that piece is, if you can't name that tune, you've already lost out on at least 5 or 6 points off of your exam. Now imagine if you can only identify like 1 or 2 of the listening examples that you were given in your exam. That means that you have lost out on possibly maybe around 15 to 20 something points off of your exam. Sometimes you can get away with listing a few stylistic details that you recognize in a piece that you don't remember the composer or the name of, but chances are by that point you're probably freaking out in the exam. And when you are freaking out in the exam, it's very difficult to listen and identify things that you're not sure of in the first place. Then, typically you are given a short answer section. These short answer sections tend to ask about stylistic things in a certain era. I thought that it was the exact same as doing it in my IB history course, which is you just list a couple of bullet points and you don't really explain anything, okay? You just kind of put it there. However, in university, answering like that on a music history exam is typically not enough. The professors want to know that you actually know your material. You actually understand it, that you're not just regurgitating everything that you are learning in class and in your textbooks. This means that you should not simply list the stylistic details, you should provide an explanation for each one. Define what that stylistic detail is, and then maybe provide an example that it's used in, provide an example of why it was important to the era, maybe provide an example of how it came about and how it affected other styles in the same era. Basically, you want to pretend that you can do an entire professional presentation on the things that you are studying for the exam. Now, when it comes to the essay questions, I was actually surprised that I was not simply expected to, again, regurgitate everything I learned in the textbook and in the lectures. I was often asked questions that would make me think critically about what I learned. Studying for music history suddenly becomes not just memorizing facts, not just memorizing music, not just memorizing years. Now you have to relate one thing that happened in music history to another thing that happened in music history. You need to connect the two. You need to talk about how one thing affected this other thing, how one thing made this other thing happen, or how one thing made this other thing not happen. You need to not just memorize what happened, you need to understand why it happened. In music history courses, the professors don't necessarily tell you explicitly why something happened. They'll give you what happened, but you yourself need to think critically about how all those things that happened actually are linked up together. So a big hint for studying music history is that typically you are studying how something developed. How did all of these things that happened cause this other thing to develop? So for example, how did neumes and mensuration signs become time signatures and the modern written notation? So you don't want to just talk about this happened in the medieval era and they wrote things this way. Now in the modern age, now we write things this way. You can't just say that. You need to talk about why it developed into how we write notation today. If you want the answer to that, basically the short answer is that the way we write music today has developed so that we have a standard of reading music. Whereas before it was really just kind of scribbles to remind themselves how a piece went. Now we have a very specific way of writing music so that everyone can read the same music and actually produce the same notes. So that would be like the short answer version, whereas you would expound on that and give more examples, and you would tie more things together in terms of mensuration signs with time signatures and stuff like that. You would talk about more of that kind of stuff in like a full-on essay question. So, the moment you guys have all been waiting for. I thought I would share with you guys an exam that I failed miserably. I'll be covering the name of the professor and my student number simply for privacy's sake. I ended up with a grand total of 14 points out of 25. 14 out of 25. I got a grand total of 56% on this exam. I mean what I say when I say I am just another flutist. This is the lowest grade I have ever gotten on any of my exams. So I kept it as a reminder. I have been there, okay? I have been where you guys are, which is walking into a music history course and not knowing what the heck you're doing. For the listening portion here, I got a grand total of 1 out of 10. Oh, wonderful! My professor marked all of my stylistic details incorrectly. This shows us that I did not actually understand any of these stylistic details of these pieces. Of course, I learned after this. You will notice here on the top it says quiz number 1. Quiz number 2 was not so bad. Give 3 forerunners of opera. I wrote madrigal, intermedio, and I put cantata. I don't know why I put cantata. I think I was guessing there. My professor wrote pastoral, which he is absolutely right. I think what got me there was that I had never made the connection in my mind that these things like the madrigal, intermedio, the pastoral that we were studying, I never made the connection that they were the forerunners of opera. Never made the connection. So when I saw that question, I was like, what? What do you mean? Which of course means that when I was studying, I was simply memorizing facts. I was not actually connecting two ideas. By the way, if you guys are wondering why I'm giving you guys the answers to this test, this professor does not teach there anymore. So these exams are not given out anymore. Now we have give 3 categories of instrumental music in the early Baroque and 1 genre for each category. So I thought I would get full points for this, but I actually got half points. I think what happened here was that I wasn't understanding that genre is not stuff like prelude, fugue, and trio sonata. Those are types of pieces. That is not a genre. So that means that I was completely misunderstanding what exactly a prelude, fugue, and trio sonata even were. I'm not seeing the big picture here. I'm just memorizing little details, and that obviously is not enough to carry you through an exam. Now for our short essay questions. I remember writing for this. I don't remember what I wrote, but I remember what I was feeling. And I felt like I was just trying to squeeze every last drop of what I knew about the things that he asked about here. Basically, what I was doing was just writing in full sentence form bullet points, but I wasn't actually making any real conclusions of these details that I was regurgitating. So it's not a surprise that the first question I got half points on. I got a 5 out of 10, and the second question I got 7 out of 10. So he basically gave me points for the details that I regurgitated, but there were no points left to give because I didn't provide more than that. To be really honest, I am cringing so hard reading this stuff. So we're just gonna put that down now. The professor himself was pretty disappointed in us. I don't blame him. I think by that point, he was expecting us to respond and think critically like full-grown adults, when in truth, most of us had pretty much just gotten out of high school the year before. We weren't used to thinking this way. We had never been asked to think critically and be able to write out our critical thoughts in a concise way. Again, kind of like how I said a few weeks ago with my private teacher, there was a clash of expectations. We all walked in thinking that we would have no problem identifying the pieces that we heard, that we would only have to pretty much just regurgitate everything we memorized, and that was that. Whereas our professor really wanted us to learn the material not in terms of facts, but in terms of how music history actually developed. He really wanted us to understand how music was played back then, why it was different back then, and how it developed over time. So there you have it. I hope that this video can help those of you who are walking into music history for the first time. Hopefully this will make it so that it's not as rude of an awakening for you guys for your first exam. I hope my experience helped you guys. If you guys have had a similar experience with your music history exams, please let us know in the comment section below. I think it would be really fun for us to all share our experiences. And as usual, if you like this video, make sure you give me a big thumbs up and hit subscribe for new videos every Saturday. My last video is over there, and if you want to catch me during the week, my social media networks are down there. But otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Bye. Also, please excuse any sweat that you see on my face. It is extremely warm here in Seattle today. Most of you will know from my other videos that I don't normally wear spaghetti strap tank tops, but today I have no choice.